Hi everyone, my name is Albert Świdziński. Welcome to another Strategy and Future podcast. With me today is Professor Hugh White, who has been our guest numerous times, always with Jacek. This is the very first time I can speak with Professor White. Thank you, Professor White, for accepting the invitation. Professor White, let me
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Albert.
Thank you. Maybe I could just start with introduction, although I'm pretty sure many of our subscribers and viewers know full well who Professor White is, but Professor White is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at Australian National University in Canberra, former advisor to Australian government, co-author of Australia's white paper, if I remember correctly. And perhaps, well, I don't know if most importantly, but most importantly for me is author of How to Defend Australia, written in 2019. And I told Professor White offline that this was one of the most insightful books when it comes to strategy, thinking about strategy, not just how Australia deals with its security environment, but the way of thinking about strategy. And on a personal note, when you described Palmer stones, concentric circles, it sent me on a pathway to understand grand strategy more than just Colin Gray, etc. And sooner or later, this has led me to thinking about US grand strategy and people like Christopher Line, who wrote about it extensively, and preponderance and primacy. And in 2023, this all has yielded a text where I concluded that US will move away from primacy inevitably. It's only a matter of how and when, but the direction is certain. And coming back to you in 2010, so this was 2023. In 2010, you've written China Choice. So 15 years ago, a decade and a half ago. And of course, I've been following everything, pretty much everything. Whenever there is something online, I go through it. So I've heard the warnings you heeded to the Australian strategic community about the inevitability of what's about to happen. And I feel this warning has not been heeded. Now it's year of our Lord 2025. And you've been proven right. So my first question is, how does it feel to be proven right when being proven right means that your nation is in grave danger? Very much.
Well, thank you, Albert, for that very generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I always enjoy doing these sessions with Jacek, so it's a great pleasure to be back again, and particularly at this moment when there's so much going on. Look, you described my predicament very kindly, but I will confess that it has been, my experience over the last, 15 years, as you say, that I have been very consistently arguing that I thought that the dependence that Australia has on America continuing to play the role in Asia and globally that we've all got used to it playing, that our dependence on that is increasingly unwise because of the very deep trends which seem to me to make it very likely that the United States will, one way or another, step back from that role. And I've discovered two things in that process. The first is that there's no useful or dignified way of saying "I told you so." It's just it doesn't help, and nobody wants to hear it anyway. But the other thing, I guess the conclusion I draw is that it is worth, eventually, if your analysis is correct, then events will come around to prove you're right. And it's never too late to start reacting sensibly to what's happening. I mean, of course, Australia would be much better off if 15 years ago we'd started thinking more deeply as a country about the future trajectory of Asia and the trajectory of the United States' role in Asia, and had started doing some of the things which, to be honest, I was saying back then we should be doing. But we didn't. Okay. But here we are in 2025 in circumstances very different from the ones I initially envisaged. The trend of US stepping back from global leadership, from strategic primacy in Asia is, I think, very clear, as it is in Europe. And it's now time to start doing things. And I think this is the European experience too. I think, frankly, and I mean, I made this argument when I had some conversations with Polish colleagues back when How to Defend Australia came out in 2019 about how my analysis of Australia's predicament fitted Poland's and Europe's. And, so I think, Europe could have, not Poland, I might say, but I think Europe as a whole could have responded with much more foresight and imagination to what seemed to me to be very clear trends. I mean, particularly after what Russia had done in 2014. But it's not too late now. I mean, it would have helped a lot if Europe had started doing what Europe's doing this week 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But it's never too late to start trying to get your head around it and start getting things right. So, press on with the analysis, I think, is the right answer.
So, but one particular thing when it comes to Poland is that the delay means maximalist options are very risky to pursue at this point in time, especially knowing the difference in geography. It's a land environment rather than maritime.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. And partly because both countries, all of us countries who've been depending on the United States, are now going to have to move much faster. Some options that we had are no longer available, or at least won't be available for a long time. And some of the things that we feel we need to do will be riskier to do because we have to do them faster, riskier administratively and as a project management sense. We'll have to buy things and get things into service faster than we otherwise would have. But also riskier strategically because the steps that we could have taken over a decade, we're now going to try and do in 2 or 3 years or even less. And that, I think, does engender some additional strategic risk. So I think there is that that's something that's something we've lost, the opportunity to do things slowly and in a measured way. But there's no good crying over spilt milk, as the phrase in English has it. You just got to press on. We are where we are. Let's get on with it. Look, the contrast and comparisons between Australia's situations and Poland's, I think, is very interesting. And I was very struck when, your Polish colleagues kindly thought to publish a translation into Polish of my How to Defend Australia. And I said to them, surely you do understand that Australia's strategic situation is very different from Poland's. And in some ways, we're diametrically opposite because Australia is the most maritime environment of any country in the world, maybe except maybe New Zealand. It's not just that we're an island, but we're an island surrounded by islands and with very great maritime distances between us and potential threats or aggressors. Whereas Poland, you might say, has in some ways at least one of the most continental strategic environments of any country in the world. And Poland's history is all about the history of what its positioning between Russia and Germany and the rest of Europe, but I guess really Russia and Germany, or the German nations, means. And so on the one hand, the contrast is very strong, and in one dimension, it favours Australia because what seems to me, when I think about how Australia might move on from a strategic mindset in which we depend on the United States to a strategic mindset in which we depend on ourselves, what really strikes me, and the argument I really set out in How to Defend Australia, is that it's all about exploiting that maritime environment, which does give the defence very strong advantages over offence. I think in the present state of technology, but based on very long-term technological trends going all the way back to the late 19th century, at the strategic level, defence is much easier than offence. In the maritime domain, and Australia has the advantage of very long maritime approaches, whereas of course Poland doesn't have that. And it seemed to me that made adopting the kind of approach that I had taken in How to Defend Australia to Poland quite difficult, at least at the sort of actual operational level, as opposed to the strategic level. On the other hand, Poland has one big advantage that Australia doesn't have. And I know this is a complex topic, but when I look at Poland, or for that matter, other Europeans, in the predicament they face right now, the big thing they have going for them is that they have this, very dense, complex, and ambivalent in many ways, but still very dense connection with your neighbours. Whereas the thing about Australia is it's completely alone.
Sure.
So, the challenge for Poland in imagining, and challenge for the whole of Europe, in imagining a new approach to security which doesn't depend on the United States and which therefore depends more on your neighbours, with all of the complex history that entails, it's very demanding diplomatically. But viewed strategically, and diplomatically, and I might even say psychologically, but viewed strategically, you in Poland are, if I can put it this way, will very soon, if not already, be standing on the front line against Russia. But behind you is Germany and France and Britain. And now, of course, the question is, how confident can you be in them? Well, as I say, it's a huge diplomatic challenge. But compared to Australia, the fact that, the bad news is that you're in a very continental strategic environment in which the advantages of defense over offense are much less clear. The good news is that you stand as part of a very dense continent with many very strong frameworks for cooperation. There's NATO, and even if you remove the US from NATO, there's still a lot of institutional structure there that you can use. And there's the EU, and for all the complexities and ambiguities and strangeness about the EU, it still does look to me like a very robust political and psychological foundation for close cooperation. So there's good news and bad news in our respective predicaments.
It is interesting whether EU, because, historically when someone tried to establish regional hegemony in Europe, it was done via iron and blood and iron, as dear Chancellor Bismarck put it. It is interesting whether lacking US involvement, which dampened all the internal rivalries and moved them to abstract level of jockeying for power within the EU institutions, whether Europe's going to go back to what it always was, which is fighting against one.
Oh, that's a fascinating question, and it would be presumptuous of an Australian to offer a European view on the issue, but I'm going to anyway, because look, it does seem to me that, and I should say up front here that partly because I view it from the luxury of great distance, I do think the EU is a remarkable achievement by its members. And one of the things that's remarkable about it is that it seems to me that the former great powers of Europe, Germany, France, Britain, I'll come back to Russia in a minute, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire, well, that disappeared. But those former great powers, which had previously been so focused, set on exactly as you said, on their rivalries over centuries, under the aegis of NATO and the EU, those countries ceased to regard themselves as great powers. They ceased to have the sort of mental habits of great powers. I mean, we could say there are still some vestiges of it. There are vestiges of it in the French and British nuclear deterrents. There are vestiges of it in the aircraft carriers, and in the way they think of themselves in relation to their former colonial possessions. Those are vestiges of their thinking of themselves as great powers. But in terms of their relationship with one another, of course, the French can be high-handed and the Germans can be a little bit heavy-handed sometimes. But I do think that they really don't think of themselves as great powers. And so I do think the capacity for them to sublimate their position for a European agenda is now, pretty solid. And of course, that's the contrast with Russia, because I think what everybody hoped at the end of the Cold War was that Russia could somehow be brought into a Europe in which the former great powers no longer conducted themselves as great powers and saw themselves as components of something bigger. And Russia never bought that. I mean, maybe Gorbachev himself had that sort of conception. But one reason why Russia, it's always seemed to me that Russia would never become another France or Germany or Britain, another former great power, in other words, was that Russia's not just a European power.
Yes.
It's so big that it couldn't, you know, France and Britain and Germany are all just European powers. Russia is a sort of transcontinental power, and it always seemed to me a very different kind of proposition. And the other thing is, I think it was difficult for Russia to take the step that the European powers took in stepping down from great powers sort of status and psychology, precisely because it had been so humiliated by the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it always seemed to me there was a kind of inherent instability in the way in which Russia at first accepted and now, of course, resists the redrawing of its western borders at the end of the Cold War and with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I think, you know, I do think I have a fairly high level of confidence that with the withdrawal of the United States from Europe, which I do think is, you know, an established, I mean, right. Even without Donald Trump, I thought it was an established fact. But yes. The withdrawal of the United States from Europe does, I think, give the Europeans, you know, an imperative to start viewing Europe not just as an economic and social and geographical entity, but also as a strategic entity. And I think that the great powers can be persuaded to go along with that. And the last point I'd make in that setting is that, of course, that the greatest imperative for them to do that is, of course, Russia itself. Now, if Europe didn't face the Russia that we face today, the Russia of Vladimir Putin, and you know, all that's happened in the last 10 years and the last 3 years, if Europe didn't face that, then there might be temptations for the former great powers to start reasserting themselves as great powers. But the imperative now for them to cooperate together, for them to start addressing really difficult, complex questions that we've seen raised quite explicitly just in the last few days, like how does the French and presumably British nuclear capabilities become a European nuclear capability, which is a really critical and difficult question. But if Europe can find a way to solve that, and I think they probably can, it'll be largely Vladimir Putin's work, because it's the challenge that he and his Russia poses to Europe, I do think compels Europe to get together. And you know, call me a little bit naive or even optimistic, but I just think the Europeans are going to make that work. And there's the contrast with Asia, because I tell you, in Asia, it's not going to happen. Japanese, if and as I believe is happening right now, as America withdraws from Asia as well, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Australians will all be on our own.
It's very interesting, because I think I would imagine that the question is also whether it is a great power identity or nation states and national interests and inevitable variance between, you know, exposure to risk among Europeans, because, you know, for us, Russia is an existential threat. But for everybody west of Oder, you know, they won't be marching through under the Brandenburg Gate, the Russians. So the threat is limited.
Well, I mean, I think, of course, there's a great deal in the geography, absolutely central. And one of the things that strikes me when I look at a map of Europe is just how compact geographically it is. Yes. Now, of course, Poland feels much, much more exposed to well, let's be blunt, to Russian aggression than countries to your west. But one of the things that strikes me about Europe is because it's geographically so contiguous, because, you know, if all of these countries, nations are jammed up against one another, then not just in a sort of psychological sense as to how they conceive themselves as countries, but in a very concrete, specific question of strategic interests and operational imperatives. Each of those countries across what you might call, you know, the great North European expanse, you know, Ukraine, Poland, Germany, France, each has intense strategic interests in the security of the other. And so I can easily see how, sitting in Berlin, the idea that Ukraine might fall to Russia is not too alarming, much less alarming to Germany than it is to Poland. But once Germany, once that happens, once Poland is the frontline state, if that's what happens, and I pessimistically think perhaps for the purposes of our conversation, we should entertain that possibility, then Germany starts to have an extremely strong interest in the security of Poland. And I don't think anyone in Germany imagines that there's no question that they can't imagine the Russians crossing the Oder. After all, the Russians have crossed the Oder before.
Did that before.
And so I think, I mean, my slightly melodramatic way of putting this is that, you know, ever since the days of Peter the Great, one of the defining questions in European strategic affairs has been how far west does the rest of Europe allow Russia to come? And in 1814 they were in Paris, and from 1945 to 1989, 1990 they are in the middle of Germany. For most of the time they've been in the middle of Poland. You know, most of the time since Peter the Great, the question, the answer Europe gave to how far west you allow Russia to come is halfway across Poland. You know, basically the Vistula, I guess, has been the sort of traditional, something like the traditional front line. But I don't think it's very hard. Let me put it this way. I can see, and we can see, I think, from what's happened in the last 3 years, that it's quite hard to persuade Germans that a Russian threat to Ukraine is a threat to Germany. But I don't think it's very hard to persuade Germans that a Russian threat to Poland is a threat to Germany. Mm-hmm. And so I do think Germany, you know, it, not just because of its scale, but also because of its location in the center, it is the key to this. And in a sense, that's good news for Poland. Because I think Germans really should feel that the security of Poland is literally vital to their security. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's one of the things that makes me that's one of the things that makes me optimistic that Europe can respond appropriately. Too late, should have started 10 years ago, but they can respond appropriately to the enormous challenge they face right now.
If I could circle back to the Pacific, you mentioned the loneliness, the feeling of loneliness. This is, you know, the soothing aspect of geography, the distant, unlike the claustrophobic, you know, land theater.
Yes, that's right.
The 𝗪𝗫, you know, the soothing, you know, whether it's mountain ranges or vast expanse of ocean. I remember the Prime Minister of Australia before 𝗀𝗶𝗱𝗃, when Guam Doctrine was announced. I think it was before 𝗀𝗶𝗃.
Yes.
Guam Doctrine was announced. The Brits, a couple years back, I think, you know, divested from the region, and he said, "We are here all alone. I think he said something along the lines, not a single white face in sight." But for Australia,
that's right.
This was, and I remember, but for Australia, of course, this was terrifying because Nixon, Guam Doctrine, you know, very similar, extremely similar, at least superficially, very similar to what Trump is doing. You know, withdraw 20,000 troops from South Korea. But for Australia, it under Whitlam, it created an environment where Australia was free to really define its national interest and grand strategy of its own. Get in contact, establish better diplomatic, commercial relations with countries around. And I remember when I wrote my little paper on the Nixon doctrine, I remember quoting you where you said, at the end of the day, the Guam Doctrine has proven to be a false alarm because China was a benevolent.
Yes.
To what extent comparison with Guam Doctrine is superficial, and to what extent it's fitting to what is happening today?
Oh, really interesting question. Look, I think I do think there are very big differences. Let me just speak first of all from a purely Australian perspective, and then think about it more in a global perspective. From the Australian perspective, the Guam Doctrine was one of the event of Nixon's declaration at Guam, and as you mentioned, the British announcement of their withdrawal east of Suez the year before, was part of a whole pattern of events which occurred from the mid-60s through to the mid-70s. They really started with a fundamental change in Indonesia when the very adventurous government under President Sukarno, which Australians had seen as very threatening, was replaced with a new order under President Suharto, who proved to be a much, much more congenial neighbour for Australia. And so at that point, we ceased really to worry about Indonesia. Then that was the good news. Then we had the bad news of Guam and east of Suez and the evident failure in Vietnam, in which we were very deeply involved. But then we had the good news of the opening to China. And that was a really significant thing, which happened in 72, of course, so a couple of years later. But it was all part of the same, big moment of history. And so what Australia found after the Guam Doctrine was that the bad news was the United States had said that they weren't essentially going to defend us. But the good news was that our anxieties about Indonesia had eased, and our anxieties about China had eased because of the opening. And the really critical thing was that from 1972 onwards, Australia was no longer feared any Asian great powers. Ever since the rise of Japan in the late 19th century through until 1945, Australia had been anxious about Japan. It had been our principal strategic concern. And that, of course, had disappeared not just with the defeat in 1945, but with the establishment of the Yoshida Doctrine and the willing acceptance of Japan as its place within a US-led strategic framework. But China had arisen, and the potential threat from communist China, this is the China before it rose economically, but it was still very potent in many ways. The concern about China drove Australian strategic policy from 1949 all the way through to 1972. But so the good news for us was that the United States had stopped defending us, and so had the British. But we had much, much less to worry about. And that was the setting in which Australia could, if you like, stretch its wings, start to reach out, start to engage with our own region much more energetically, stop worrying so much that quote you mentioned is a very, very pertinent and poignant one. Stop worrying about the fact that there were no other white faces around. We could work with the people and the countries that we were surrounded with. So, in the end, Guam and that whole set of events around Guam turned out to be a very beneficial turning point for Australia. It made us feel more self-confident, more self-reliant, and that was part of the psychology of the Whitlam era in Australia in the early 70s. But that was carried on with his successors, Malcolm Fraser and Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. I mean, working with those guys was a very big part of my career, and this was an Australia that was very self-confident engagement with the region, and very focused on building up connections with the region. Now, the tragedy for Australia is that has slipped backwards as China has returned as a strategic threat to Australia, or at least a perception of a strategic threat to Australia. We could come back to that if you like, but that perception is certainly there. Then instead of continuing the trend to work with our region, we've gone back to what you might call pre-Guam psychology.
Regress
of clung more and more.
Yes, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And not just strategically, but also psychologically.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we Australians are more psychologically dependent on the United States, more anxious about there being no other white faces than at any time since the 1970s. I mean, Australia is psychologically more dependent on the United States today than it was when I first started working in this business in the 1980s, in the early 1980s. And of course that, I believe that's based on a really fundamental strategic mistake, because it's based on the assumption that the Americans are going to stay around and do for us in the future what they used to do for us long ago. So that that's sort of Australian perspective. And I think, in a sense, what we need in Australia now is a new Guam Doctrine. America, if I can put it in this slightly provocative way, would do us a favor. Donald Trump is almost doing us a favor by making clear to us in his incredibly rude and thoughtless and cruel, preposterous manner, he's sending us the message we need to hear.
Yes.
And he's sending it in a way that we can't help but pay attention to. And you could say the same thing is happening to the Europeans.
And not introducing a false sense of security, which would make politicians go over wrong assumptions about the world. Yes.
That is exactly right. I mean, the fact is that Australian political leaders, and I think also European political leaders, have been misled by listening to what Washington has been saying under leaders like Biden, and not paying attention to what Washington has been doing.
Yes.
Which is effectively nothing, or at least not nearly enough. And so I think that's very sort of, spectacular. The point about viewing Guam from the global perspective is that, and again, I think people don't quite focus on this enough, but really the Cold War in Asia ended in 1972 because the Soviet Union never had a strong position in the Western Pacific. I mean, it had Cam Ranh Bay, and of course, it's got Vladivostok, it's got its own Pacific territories. But strategically speaking, the Soviet Union was just never a deal for us. And once the Americans had neutralized China as a Cold War rival, China was no longer contesting America's position as the leading power in East Asia and the Western Pacific, the Cold War was over. And I think, in the historians will judge that was actually a very big factor in putting the United States in a position where it could prevail in the Cold War writ large, against the Soviet Union. But that fundamentally changed things. But and of course, it provided a framework in which Nixon and Kissinger could pursue détente. But I see détente as less significant than other people, as a phase in the Cold War is less significant than other people do in the history of the Cold War, because it seems to me that fundamentally the Cold War was all about two powers both primarily focused on preserving the status quo. That is, even through the 50s and 60s, before détente came on the table, and in the 80s when things got more, when détente appeared to fall by the wayside, the primary strategic objective of both the superpowers was to prevent any shift in the balance between them in their adversaries' favor. But neither of them were trying to overturn the relationship between them. They both basically accepted one another as great powers. There was always talk in Washington about pushing back and trying to, liberate Poland and all that sort of thing, reverse the crimes of Yalta. But that was just sort of crazy talk in Washington. The core of US strategic policy was to preserve the status quo. And the same, I'm sure there were crazies in the Kremlin, but the same was basically true in the Kremlin. And so I do think that what Guam meant and the transformation of the Asian strategic order meant in that period from Guam through to 1972, I do think that and even, could say through the fall of Saigon in 1975, I think what Guam meant was not a kind of an interregnum in the Cold War, but actually just a clarification of the Cold War, a refocusing of the Cold War back on Europe where it had begun. And which ended up, I think, in the long run being to America's advantage.
And do you think, again, the obvious, if somehow tired analogy would be a reverse Nixon Kissinger today, with the sequencing, how baked sequencing, as O&A described it, because the idea was you have to put a permanent block to Russian westward expansion, and then offer alternatives to China as a development, in Far East regions. Do you see this as an element of U.S. strategy, or is it just divesting from primacy in a fire sale kind of deal?
Yeah, I think the reverse Kissinger argument
there aren't conditions that there were. Yeah.
Sorry.
I said that the conditions were obviously very different back then.
Oh yes. But I still think that argument could work. if I was convinced that the United States was really serious about trying to contain China's challenge to US primacy in the Western Pacific, then it would make a lot of sense to do what Trump is doing. But I don't think the Americans are serious in East Asia any more than they are in Europe. And I therefore when I look at Trump, I see a man who is no more concerned about the idea of China taking America's place as the dominant power in East Asia and the Western Pacific than he is concerned with the idea that of America relinquishing its leadership role in the strategic system in Europe. Mm-hmm. I think he never has, going all the way back into before he went into politics. Trump has never bought the whole idea of America as a global leader. He wants to be America to be the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, of course. Mm-hmm. His Monroe Doctrine on steroids. You can ask the Canadians and the Danes about, and the Panamanians about that. But I think that the underlying rationale for what Trump is doing in Europe is not that he wants to block China; it's that he wants to get out of Europe. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's as simple as that. But having said that, I do think there is a corollary which is very important, and that is that one of the reasons why I believe that it makes, this is a very strange thing to say, but I believe that Trump, in the deepest instincts underlying Trump's deplorable diplomacy, are actually strategically correct. Mm-hmm. Why I think he's right that America shouldn't continue to play those roles is precisely that that the fact of Russia and Russia's residual strength as a peculiar, unbalanced but still potent great power is one of the reasons why the key reason, in fact, why America does not need to worry, can afford to see China take its place as leading power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. Were it not for Russia, if in place of Russia you had a whole patchwork of tiny, weak states, then a China that dominated East Asia and the Western Pacific would have a good chance of going on to dominate Eurasia.
Yes.
And one thing I will always hold to is that America will never tolerate any single power dominating Eurasia. That's what's forced it into Eurasia in the First World War in 1917, when the Russians pulled out of the First World War and it looked like the Germans were going to win. It's what drove them into the Second World War in 1941, where the Russians were at the gates of Moscow and the Japanese were at the gates of Singapore, and it's what drove it to engage in the Cold War. The fear that the Soviet Union would end up dominating the whole of Eurasia. But China, as a strategic rival in East Asia and the Western Pacific, is very potent. But as a potential hegemon over the whole of Eurasia, doesn't have a chance, because actually I think India is also a significant factor there, but really it's Russia that is the bloc. And this is a slightly perverse thing to say in March of 2025, but in the long run, Europe is going to rely on Russia to keep China at bay, and so will America.
But because if you look at China, in general, I'm sorry for interrupting, establishing regional hegemony almost never happens, let alone extra regional like the US has gone for, and some say achieved, some say they didn't. So there are very natural blocks to China, and actually the US, so Japan, India, Russia, as you said. So US trying to hold on to primacy, even though you're completely right, it's not Trump, it's been Biden, it's more than people, it's sort of like fighting gravity. It's very a historic period, as Secretary Rubio put it. But there are very, very, very natural blocks to Chinese expansion, very strong, and the US trying to hold on to the region actually both puts it at peril of direct confrontation, but also makes the allies less likely to arm themselves, like Europeans are trying to do now, which is a natural reaction to a balance. When you're only you get a balance, with something, right? Do you think China would even have this aspiration, or a regional hegemony different than tributary system?
Yes, look, very interesting question. I mean, there's two parts to it at least. One is that I I mean, in any political system, in any strategic community, you will have people with grandiose ambitions. And so I wouldn't be at all surprised if out there in the Chinese think tanks, or for that matter, even in Zhongnanhai itself, there are people who say China should rule the world. But I've never seen any evidence that that is a serious aspiration of the sort of, center of gravity of Chinese strategic ambitions and perceptions. I do think they take terribly seriously the idea that they seek a place in the world in which they are the equal to the other strongest powers and subordinate to none of them. I think they're very determined to see a genuinely multipolar global order in which they are one of the top tier of countries. An interesting question, how many others there would be in that top tier. But I don't see any sign that they want to rule the world. It's always worth bearing in mind that no country has ever ruled the world. It appeared for a little while in the 1990s that America might do that, but it ended up not doing it, and not doing it for very deep reasons. So I think, I don't think I don't think we need to take seriously the thing that many in America worry about, and that is that China is setting out to establish a global authoritarian hegemony. I just don't think that's going to happen, apart from anything else, because the United States is not going anywhere. I mean, it's still going to dominate the Western Hemisphere, whatever happens. None of my analysis is about the United States not remaining an extraordinarily powerful and to its adversaries extraordinarily dangerous country. But it's just going to define what it wants to achieve much more narrowly. So I think, I think China is focused on becoming the primary power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. Now, in that sphere, I think it has a good chance of succeeding. I'll come back in a minute and say what I mean by that. But when you look at the other powers in East Asia and the Western Pacific, well, it's Japan and nobody else really. And I don't think, I used to think when I wrote the China choice back in 2010, you mentioned earlier, I thought Japan would re-emerge as a great power in the East Asian strategic system and will function as a significant constraint on Chinese ambitions. But that was at a time when I imagined, I believed anyway, that the Japanese were really focused on preserving their position as a great power. Now, what's interesting is that, or you might say reasserting their position as a great power, is America's role in the region fell as its position relative to China declined. Japan would feel compelled to step up and reoccupy the position of a great power that it relinquished in 1945. But what we've seen in the intervening 15 years is Japan doing really nothing. It's a bit like the United States. When if you think, for example, and it's a very crude measure, but it is a measure of the trend of Japanese defense spending. Japan's defense spending, when it was only 1% of Japan's huge GDP, was much bigger than China's in 2000. And in the intervening decades, China's spending has way overtaken Japan's, and the Japanese have done nothing about it. Now, a country that was really serious about preserving its position as a middle power would have forgotten about 1% of GDP and would have been spending 3% of GDP years ago.
The question is whether it's not the overbearing mother, the United States, that same case as Australia, perhaps abandoned.
I think. Well, I think the thing for Japan is that it was enormously convenient and congenial, as for the Europeans, I might say, to continue to rely on the United States. And I think also you might say there's sort of a psychological, almost social tendency in the policy elites amongst US allies to want to keep saying things that people in Washington wanted to hear. I don't think one ever wants to underestimate that. And certainly I can tell you from personal experience that the people in Washington didn't want to hear the alternative view. But I do think the question for the re-question for Japan was, if it wasn't going to continue to rely on the United States, what was it going to become? And on the one hand, it could become again a great power if it really invested in its strategic weight. But the alternative is for it to become a very capable middle power in its own right. And the thing about Japan, and this is partly because going back to some of the things we said before about maritime, it has the advantage of being an offshore island. The thing about Japan is that it can build a secure future for itself in an Asia in which China is the primary power because of its capacity to defend itself independently. Now, of course, it would need a minimum nuclear deterrent, but that's easy for Japan's point of view.
Yes.
Japan is probably the only country in the world for whom acquiring a nuclear capability is almost a trivial technical and economic task. It's simply a political question. But they have I think when I look at Japan, I see a country which one of the reasons it was able to make the decision not to reassert itself as a great power was that it had the option of building a different kind of future for itself, not one that contested China's position across the region as a whole, but someone who just kept China at bay. It would always, of course, have to be attentive to China's concerns and interests. But I think as long as the Japanese felt they could defend their most vital interests from China, then they would be able to.
Professor White, I know we're running out of time. I have one final question, if that's okay, and then
of course, yes.
So you mentioned nuclear weapons again. Japan is it's months away. I just finished a book about proliferation, and Australia is mentioned as one of the countries that would be able to. You had a program. Also, the way you quit it under US pressure, because you were working with the Brits, as far as I remember, the way you quit it was also, I think, a sign of things to come when it comes to subservient position vis-a-vis great and powerful friends. It was a very, it's always a very strategic decision whether to abandon or pursue nuclear weapons. But the question is, countries, middle powers that are threatened with abandonment by a guarantor, a patron state, historically face three options. They could accommodate to the threatening power, to the preponderant regional player that threatens them. They could declare neutrality. They could seek regional alliances. And I think Australia tried to seek augment its alliance structure with regional engagement. After 1945, obviously a new option has been created to deter by punishment without the ability to defeat other players' army, which is to nuclearize. Which way do you think Australia will go?
Really interesting question. Of course, they're not all mutually exclusive.
No, they aren't.
I mean, a very important feature of Australia's predicament is that we are a very long way from China. Now, of course, all of that water between us and them is both a barrier and a highway. It's quite easy for the Chinese to get to us, but it's quite easy for us to stop them. And so I do think we have, and that's really what my How to Defend Australia book was all about. We do have the option, I think, of building a conventional military position which would raise the costs and risks to China of projecting power against Australia to the point where it wasn't worth the Chinese while. And going back to something we just touched on before, I don't think that's a problem for the Chinese because I don't think their model of regional hegemony is what you might call a very extreme one. I don't think they want to, emulate Joseph Stalin in the 1950s.
They never had.
Sort of.
Yes.
I think in fact their model of regional hegemony is more like their own historical tributary system, or the other analogy I use is America in the Western Hemisphere. Now, America in the Western Hemisphere under the Monroe Doctrine allows other countries in the Western Hemisphere, most of the time, except under Trump, a fair amount of liberty, a fair amount of of latitude. And I think China as a hegemonic power in the Western Pacific would be a fairly light hegemon. So I think, for Australia, the option of, the first option sort of going along with it is one that we can, is not as horrifying for us as you might think. The second point, though, is I think what Australia will want to do is to build a kind of firewall around that. We're prepared to go along with the idea of Chinese hegemony up to a point, but we would want, a bit like the Japanese, to be able to make sure we could defend our most vital interests by being able to resist direct Chinese military pressure against us. Now, and for that reason, I do think that there is a serious prospect that down the track, Australia will have to contemplate acquiring its own nuclear capabilities for the same reason that exactly as you say, and as your Prime Minister, I think, was saying just a few days ago, this is an issue that comes on the table for countries in precisely our situation. We're dependent on US extended nuclear deterrence.
Just like after Nixon's, Project 8,
yes,
I believe, Taiwan,
exactly.
all those people. It's like clockwork.
No, that's right. Yeah, no, it's very straightforward. And I think one of the things that we're all waking up to is that the remarkable achievement of the global non-proliferation movement in the 70s and 80s and 90s, which everybody thought, I think, were tended to think was a result of a kind of a deep moral and intellectual rejection of nuclear weapons, was in fact a product of perfectly specific strategic circumstances. Yeah. And as those strategic circumstances pass, we all start to rethink it. Yes. I mean, the interesting thing, this is a bit anecdotal, if I can put it this way, but I had a chapter in my How to Defend Australia book in which I explored quite specifically this question from Australia's perspective. And I thought that would be, when the book came out in Australia, I thought that would be enormously controversial and that I'd be very heavily criticised from all sides for even suggesting the idea that Australia should ever contemplate that. Well, the fact is, most people, a lot of the responses, including public responses I had, were people saying, yeah, no, that's right. That's something we might have to consider in the future. In other words, the things that seem unthinkable become thinkable. Now, that's not to say, that's not to say that it would be an easy choice for Australia, it'd be an extremely difficult choice for Australia. And there's just one point I need to make there, and that is that for me, nuclear weapons are not an alternative to conventional capability. That you need to be able to achieve your strategic objectives, your operational objectives with conventional weapons. The sole role of the nuclear weapons is to prevent your adversary from neutralizing your conventional capabilities with nuclear blackmail.
Sure.
You need to be able to, your nuclear weapons need to be able to neutralize his nuclear weapons so that you can then conduct the conventional campaign, so to speak, underneath that balanced arch of mutual nuclear deterrence. And that means you still have to spend all the money on building the conventional forces.
Maybe final remark, the emergence of non-proliferation regime and non-proliferation norm is one of the most astounding things to happen. Stunning that it worked.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Very good point.
It's very unnatural reaction, even knowing the the extended deterrence, the guarantees. Inherently incredible, as Schelling pointed out back in the 60s. But it did require a very close degree of cooperation between Soviets and the Americans
That's right, exactly.
Preventing They're closest
yeah. But also I'd make this point, that what made non-proliferation movement work was the credibility of extended nuclear deterrence. And what made the credibility of extended nuclear deterrence work was the very clear resolve of both the major superpowers in the Cold War to preserve the status quo. Mm-hmm. Non-proliferation worked in Europe because the Europeans really believed that America would fight a nuclear war to stop the Soviets pushing across the dividing line in Europe, and vice versa. And the same is true in Asia. What made the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Taiwanese step back from their nuclear, and Australia step back from their nuclear aspirations in the 1960s was the very strong conviction, even after the Guam Doctrine, because the Guam Doctrine did explicitly exclude nuclear aggression by nuclear armed states. Even under the Guam Doctrine, we really believe that that's something the Americans would do. And of course, it's the erosion of that which produces the new strategic circumstance we're all trying to come to terms with.
One thing that also helped prevent proliferation, which is something our Prime Minister should remember, even though it's a very stunning about face,
yes.
But that's different. But one thing that prevented proliferation is also threat of abandonment. For example, the West Germans have been told very directly that if they go nuclear, they're on their own. So
Yes, yes.
there's always the pistol to the head argument there.
I'm sure that's right. Of course, that was very important in Australia's decision as well. But I do think that wouldn't have worked if the carrot hadn't been there along with the stick. That is, if they'd said to the West Germans, "You mustn't develop nuclear weapons, or you'll be on your own." If the West Germans hadn't had a lot of confidence in American extended nuclear deterrence, they would have said, "Well, sure, we're going to be on our own anyway." So I think that was only it only worked to threaten to take away that support if you thought that support was going to be there in the first place.
And I know I'm pushing the limits here, but the question is, you're right on a strategic level, but the problem with the elite with idiosyncratic beliefs, like the Australians, like the Poles for so many years, sometimes the elite has a particular worldview which is conducive to accepting arrangements that aren't credible on their own. But
oh yeah, no, that's exactly. Well, there's a lot of history in this for Australia. All through the 1920s and 1930s, we convinced ourselves that the British would defend us from rising Japan, even though it was absolutely clear that in the face of any serious challenge in Europe, they would not have the power to deploy anything to the Western Pacific. And yet we still kept on believing in it. We called it the Singapore strategy. The British were meant to send a fleet to Singapore, and even into the Second World War. Even in 1940 and through 1941, as the threat from Japan grew, Australian government said that's okay. The British said, Churchill said, "Don't worry, we'll send a fleet if it's needed." And we knew they didn't have a fleet to send. I mean, so it's and this is very pertinent to our present predicament. The capacity of sensible people to keep believing what they want to believe in the face of mounting evidence is fruitful of many strategic disasters. Let's just hope we can avoid one this time.
yes, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Hugh White speaking to us from the future, 11th of March in Australia, I believe.
That's right. Yes,
it is in more ways than one speaking from the future. But it's 20 past 11, March 10th over here where I'm. Professor White, thank you for your time.
Well, it's a great pleasure, Albert. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, sir.